Hi, and welcome to an episode of the JetRails podcast. I'm Robert, your host, and today we're going to be talking about Magento training. We're going to be talking about getting educated and certified within the Magento community for those that are in myriad of different ways, those that are interacting with Magento's e-commerce software. I'm joined today by Joseph from the Swift Otter team, who's an expert in the field, and we're going to dive right in. Joseph, would you do the honor of introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. And it's a pleasure to be part of this podcast. I've enjoyed seeing some of your other episodes previously, and it is definitely a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so my name is Joseph. I run a company called Swift Otter. Two words, Swift and Otter to put together. But basically, been doing it since 2016. Been in the Magento space since 2011. Build websites and also train people on Magento.
Very cool. And I'm going to just start us off with one of my favorite questions. How did you come to the name Swift Otter?
I love that question. It's a great one. Yeah. So I'll be honest with you that otters are kind of my mascot. I love otters. Anytime I go to the zoo, I love watching them.
They're
love
fun. They actually play and interact. They get play right.
Well, and frankly, you see a lot of the animals at the zoo, and very few of them, at least at the Kansas City Zoo where we go, and nothing against them, but most of them animals kind of don't do much there, except for the otters. Like the otters are always having fun. And so, otters, they're creative, they're fun, they're smart. And that's who if I was to be put into an animal, that's who I'd aspire to be like, right? Because that's how I want to do business. That's how I want to live my life. I want to be a pleasure to be around. Can't say that's 100% of the time, but I want to be like that. And so that's where the otter came from. And then the first part, I want to be swift. Like everybody wants and needs things done quickly, whether we're working with a merchant and trying to help them solve a problem on their website and get a response back to a customer or somebody in an email form quickly. That's my goal in how I do business. I can't say again that it's 100% of the time, but I do my best at that. And so that's how the Swift Otter came together. Now, historically, it was related to the agency. I put that in quotes because helping customers build on the Magento platform primarily. But actually, recently, we've switched the mission of the company, kind of moving the agency side to a different name. But the company's now exclusively coming training related. So Swift Otter, it's funny because it was not necessarily specific to a platform, but it's kind of switching gears, but the name still applies. So that's how we came up with the name.
Pretty cool. Yeah, I think in our industry, we did an episode a few months back on Agile project management and looking at some of those things. I think it really does need to be baked into a culture that you are looking to be agile, you are looking to be swift. Yep. That basically, if you're going to take 6 months to get something done, by the time that you finish, the needs have changed. That you have to keep up with the market. Yeah,
it's incredibly real. Absolutely, and yeah, just is getting stuff done quickly. And also it comes back to the minimum viable product, all these buzzwords, but helping people understand truly what they need and getting it done quickly. So then you can be on to the next thing. And ultimately, again, like you mentioned, 6 months. Well, if a project takes 6 months to build, not only by the time you get to the end of it, it might be too late. It also might be completely the wrong thing that was built in those 6 months, right? So yeah, that's where fast becomes crucial, and especially in today's world.
Well, in real terms, figuring out when it was time to still be building on Magento 1 and when it was time to be building on Magento 2, or when it's time to use the Luma theme or a more traditional front end with Magento 2, or when it's time to use a progressive web app, a PWA front end. These things, depending on when you start your project and when you finish, may not be quite the same. And that's a natural challenge. It's not that a project can't take 6 months or longer, but understanding that at that point, you do need to be focused on what's the minimal viable project, as you suggested, and understanding that your needs are going to change and you need to pivot with that. Maybe we've seen in the last year or two things like payment integrations that standards changed. And so what you thought you were going to launch with and what you actually are going to launch with 6 months later might not be the same.
Oh, for sure.
So
there's a lot of totally. That.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about your background with the Magento community. How did you first get involved in the ecosystem?
Yes, that was a little while ago. 2011 is when I was first introduced with that. I've been doing, it's funny to look at me. I'm 31. So I've been doing programming, software development since I was 10. So it's in one form or another. And I'm not going to say I was professional by any stretch when I was 10 in the slightest, like nowhere close to it. But so 2011 was kind of when I had started down. I'd been doing software development somewhat commercially. But we had actually had a client that we were working with that was on PDG Cart, and probably nobody's heard of PDG Cart, but it was an old cart software that resided in the CGI bin, and permissions were a big deal. And it was kind of a work of art. You couldn't customize anything. Left sidebars were the thing, in those days. And so this customer had heard of this Magento platform, and we're like, okay, well, never done this before, but they wanted Magento Enterprise. And we're like, okay, well, we will do our best to tackle it. And so that's how I was introduced first. There was a person by the name of Lee Saferite. He works at Blue Acorn ICI now. And he was one of those heroes in my journey. And there's a number of heroes I owe a lot to. He kind of came alongside me through this project, and he gave me so much advice. He introduced me to other people, to other sources. That's really how I got to appreciate the incredible people in the Magento community, and I really mean that. Some absolutely incredible people. Then it was in 2018, I think 2019 is when we started to when I started doing the training material specifically for Magento certifications, and that's where that kind of really catapulted my interactions with the community. Up until then, it was more if I had a question or a problem, I would go to other people for help. But this is when we started really interacting and getting to know a lot more of the wonderful people in the Magento community.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've heard this from other people that one of the things that really got them to enjoy the community and the ecosystem, not just thinking of it as a software platform, but it is that camaraderie. It is that ability to get help from others and collaborate, even, people that you would otherwise think that you're competing against, but really there's enough out there for everyone. And I've personally enjoyed that. And I'll admit that most of what I learned about Magento was all school of hard knocks that like you, I was thrust into it. And, next thing I knew, I was training clients on how to use their admin, and I was project planning, sales engineering and doing things that, and really project to project that I needed to evolve with. And there were cases where until we actually attempted something, we didn't know exactly what the output would be. Until you tried the multi-address shipping and you say, oh, well, it's a feature in there. And then you realize that, if you, let's say, you're dealing with corporate gifts and you're going to send 100 gift baskets out, on behalf of this company, and they're going to upload 100 addresses, it's charging each order as its own invoice against the credit card. And after, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 times of hitting a credit card in a row, you're going to hit that point where it's going to look like fraud. And those orders aren't going to get paid instantly anymore. And until you start to think, okay, well, we thought we had a feature here. We sold you a site with that in mind, but now we're going to have to do a little bit of, a little bit of customization and some digging. And I could keep pulling examples like that, but I think that a lot of us, that's where we came to a lot of the knowledge that we got. It wasn't something that you really could learn in a classroom per se, at least at the time, because a lot of things that we were doing had been attempted by so few people.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what makes e-commerce projects so difficult in general, is that there are so many unknowns. Even if somebody considers themselves a master at a given platform, there's unknowns. There's stuff that just doesn't make sense. Like why does this interact in this way? Or boy, I never thought of this happening exactly like you mentioned with the payments and hitting like a velocity filters. That's exactly right. And I think that's what I have seen over and over again is merchants, trust is so critical in those relationships. It's and that trust is established and built through great developers, through these rockstar developers. And I've seen, in my opinion, a lot of the most successful ones are smaller agencies, and I'm no knocks against bigger ones, but when you have like the owner or somebody who takes great responsibility over the entire project, that trust level is critical. And and then that's one of the challenges of scaling an agency is continuing that trust. Finding those people. It's all comes down to the people, whether it's the developers, the project managers, to keep those projects going successfully.
I will admit that, helping to run an agency, I was not getting as much sleep at night.
It's difficult.
Things weighed on me. I'd stay late into the night often because I was responsible to people for things that that I needed to make sure happened, and it wasn't like we had a round the clock team. We were all in house in the United States, so we didn't have 3 different shifts running. And those are real challenges that you have people whose livelihoods are on the line, that if their site isn't functioning properly, somebody's paying a price for that. So
absolutely.
I think that a lot of that accountability, it's a big deal. And so going back a little bit, if you had to slice and dice, when we think about education and specialties, I know that there are a lot of different types of people that interact with these sites. What are the normal categories of those people that you normally think of, or let's call it learning tracks, maybe? I know when I go to a big Magento event, there's usually a business track and and a dev track, a technical track. But I know that there's more than that in reality. So what is it that you normally think of when you have to break this down?
I think typically in the development community, we often think of front end and back end. Back in the Magento 1 days, somebody could be pretty decent at both, right? And actually, I should clarify, front end meaning what we interact with in our web browser, right? So we go to whatever website.com and we look through the catalog and we add a product to the cart. That would be the front end. So it's more of the visual aspects of how a website is used. The back end is more how stuff interacts with the database, business logic, making certain processes happen, and then also providing more and more the layer of interaction with the front end. So that back end versus front end. So that's a typical demarcation of responsibilities, but I've even been seeing it kind of being splintered off even more past that. Backend still seems to be fairly straightforward. I mean, again, they're writing APIs, they're working through business processes, logic like that. But on the front end, like you mentioned at the beginning, PWAs are kind of shaking up the whole approach. Back in the Magento 1 days and kind of early Magento 2, a PWA wasn't really much of a thing, and it was there was a lot of JavaScript development, and JavaScript meaning basically how the front end, how interacting with a website becomes dynamic. So stuff changes when you click on it, that sort of thing. A lot of that was pretty simple, but it's become the skill level necessary has exploded with the advent of PWAs, with the complexity of requirements that are associated with a lot of these new projects. We're working on one right now where it's a very custom quoting process. So it's not like you just go to see this product on the page and click add to cart or select a color, right? You're selecting a color and you're doing a whole bunch of other customizations to this. And all of that kind of drives into the pricing. So there's a big back-end component. There's obviously APIs that have to be built out to connect the back end with the front end. So the front end can communicate the requirements back for pricing. And then it's obviously then built out as a PWA on the front end. So there's a lot more complexity in that. that is becoming required as we continue to progress into the future. But yeah, pretty much to circle back, I would say front end and back end. But again, front end is starting to splinter as well.
Interesting. And I know that I've earned certifications in M1 and M2 when it comes to the overall, solution specialist arena.
Yes.
Do you
Congratulations.
have any thoughts on? I don't know if it was that difficult, but certainly it felt good at the time. I was I was the first round of people for the M2 certification, so they made me take triple the questions, not knowing which ones they were going to grade.
I was too.
Yeah,
that was a pain. I hated that test.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, me too. It was terrible.
Yeah, well, there were some questions there that at least in that first iteration that somebody didn't get this question right. Like, it's a trick question. Yep. There is no good answer here. I hope that they don't grade this one. But
yeah. No, I get that.
Yeah. But first iteration of anything. And so outside of the developers, do you find that there are some of these other users that really struggle or really need more of that education on the admin or best practices or other facets of the platform? Maybe e-commerce managers, marketers, business owners, others that play a role somewhere in the food chain?
Yes. As far as developer stuff goes, obviously very little, right? I mean, and that was probably one of the biggest casualties. Well, the two big casualties of Magento 2, if I could say this. First, that there's no good, clean upgrade path from Magento 1 to Magento 2. It's not like going from WordPress 3 to 4 and et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's cost a lot of money for merchants. Yes, they get a clean slate, but and maybe just totally impossible. But I have that conversation regularly. It's just that the Magento 2 process is going to Magento 2 was completely a redo, and that's just how it is. And so the other casualty as a result of that is I was seeing a lot of business owners, like more of the smaller companies, who they were getting into the code and they were making updates. They had more ownership of their website. And with Magento 2, that's just not as possible. Because like if you make a change to the front end, you have to recompile your static assets, meaning like your CSS and your JavaScript. You have to recompile all that, which then can take your website down for a little bit. And if there's a problem, it's harder to troubleshoot. So that's been the challenge. So that's why I don't think developer stuff is as applicable for project managers, company owners, et cetera. But what I have seen more people going towards is, again, I approach this from a certification perspective. And I think we'll talk about my approach there later, but is there's a lot to know about the Magento admin. The Magento admin is, and ultimate, I guess by extension of that, the different features that are available with Magento. There's a lot of features that are available that few people know about, just because they haven't, had a reason to go track that stuff down. And so I would say, yes, definitely. It is very important to know your store. And I'm specifically speaking to merchants here. It's one thing for an agency to know Magento like the back of their hand, which is good. But I think it's just as critical for every merchant to also have a super solid understanding what Magento does, every feature that's available. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if a merchant wants to do something in Magento, knowing what it does or what it doesn't do will save them money, because then they don't have to go to the agency and say, hey, we need this feature built when it already exists in Magento. And hopefully the agency would be a backstop there and say, well, this already exists, or this functionality can exist if we do this, or maybe move this around or whatever. But having a solid understanding of Magento is 100% critical.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've had a facepalm moment, it's like, because you see that someone built an extension to do something that they could have done natively.
Absolutely.
And usually there's a price to pay for that. Of course, not just the upfront money, but you're conflicting with something, or you're going to have other long-term challenges. So
long-term maintenance, stuff breaks.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you there. So I was just participating in an event with the Extension Developer Network, EXTDN,
Excellent.
recently,
Yeah, love those
and
guys.
yeah, fantastic. What an amazing group of people. And
Absolutely.
they were getting together, and some of the things you've already mentioned, like progressive web apps. These are folks that are making extensions, and now there are all these different PWAs that whether it's PWA Studio from
Right.
Magento, or it's View Storefront or Deity, or I mean, you could kind of
Mhm.
keep going and going with all these different options. Now, are they going to basically, expose their extensions within all these different solutions? Basically, come up with that, or no? Now you're really leaving that for the actual developers of that individual
Mhm.
website to expose that and make it visible on the front end.
Yes.
And that's something they need to contend with as extension developers, even though these PWAs are a little bit outside their realm, and none of us have really seen one PWA solution, including Magento's own PWA Studio, really rise to the top yet. That
Mm.
I think it's still too early to peg where the community will really start going, or if there's two directions. Or usually in tech, we find that there's a limited number of long-term winners in
Absolutely.
these spheres. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think specifically to your point on PWA, uh, that's why it's so expensive. And I'm guessing that's why stuff hasn't been fully ferreted out yet, just because it is the number of merchants that are using PWA are usually the ones that have bigger budgets and they can't afford to do that. And there hasn't been that consolidation just because it has not reached that tipping point of adoption yet. And I'll be curious to see when that happens. And ultimately, just to give a shout out here, the Hiva themes. I don't know if you've heard of that. V9 and some folks at Internet recently started pulling together a new theme for Magento, and that looks incredibly promising. Like it's to me, it seems like Magento, the Luma theme done right, and I'll be curious even to see how that takes off as well. But yeah, absolutely. The PWA is, I think it's early. I agree. And has a lot of potential, a lot of promise, but I'll be very curious to see how it kind of plays out in the long run.
Yeah, it makes two of us. So maybe we'll take a step back together, and let me ask, where do you normally recommend that people start their learning journey? Have you created some more entry level materials on behalf of your team? Do you direct people to to other materials that you think, if someone is really new to the Magento platform ecosystem and community,
Mhm.
that they start their learning path, their learning journey?
Yes. I would say Magento, that's one of the awesome things about the Magento community. It's very passionate to share, very passionate to help people out. And as such, the result is there's a ton of people that write articles. Magento Dev Docs, it's the maturity of it has grown significantly over the past 3-4 years. It wasn't great at the beginning, but they've had some people who worked really hard on it and made good progress there. There's obviously people who help out on Magento Stack Exchange, that sort of thing. And so those are all super good resources. But as far as what we do internally, so I've written a course that I like to use to help get people up to speed. And also the goal, kind of, I guess you'd say the end goal is getting certified, getting the professional developer certification. And that was a blast to write, simply because my goal is to help somebody on board. But the neat thing is, with the community, there's other resources. Mark Schust has a really solid course as well. It's getting started on Magento. And there's other resources as well. So that's the cool part about the community, is that people share their knowledge and do their best to help other people through the challenges especially the common challenges that are faced out there. And one thing I do want to throw out there, though, is DevDocs, Magento Stack Exchange, all of those are great resources at blogs and et cetera. But the one challenge I've seen over and over again for beginners, and this was a challenge I faced a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, was a 5, whenever it was, when Magento 2 came out and I started learning that, is what do you trust and what do you not trust? Like what resources are good, solid, and which ones are just not good. And that's where I think starting with a course it can be helpful, because it gives you that solid starting place. And then it gives you these filters. You say, okay, well, this is a good place to start. You start to develop your intuition as far as good answers and bad answers in that. So, I think that would be what I would suggest to a someone who's looking to just start out in the Magento community.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on it a little bit right there, but for people that are getting more advanced, I know one of the challenges is that you just hit on it, that this stuff is in flux, it's changing,
oh yeah,
it's evolving.
Yes, it is.
Do you have any favorite communities for people to watch, or other suggestions or recommendations where they can stay up to date? I know there's a lot of us out there that are creating content, but what is it that you like to look at to really feel like you're keeping up to date, or to reference? And I know that you're staying at the forefront in order to create your own materials.
Oh yeah, definitely. I honestly, Magento Dev Docs are one of my favorite resources, and the trick that I like to do is when I go look at, like, I'm on a project and I need to solve a problem, I need to look up some documentation. Go there, and sometimes I'll just browse the Dev Docs for a couple extra minutes. Just try to pick up some extra things. And there's so many hidden tricks there that is really, really helpful. This seems basic, but I like to look through the release notes for every Magento version, just to stay up to speed on that. And that makes a great interview question, by the way, because the really passionate developers, they're going to know, at least generally speaking, what were the major features that were released in a Magento 2.4, Magento 2.3, whatever. And in keeping up with that is absolutely critical. Following blog.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I write these blog posts every time there's a new version release, in order to help JetRails clients stay up to date on some of the major impacts. Understanding that they won't all get through all the dev docs all that quickly, but I can scan that for them and give them the Reader's Digest version, so to speak. And, there are things that I want to say, I lose the exact track off the top of my head, but somewhere around, in the last year, maybe 2.3, some odd, they introduced an upgrade path to go from Magento open source to Magento Enterprise to Magento Commerce as more of an admin feature. And they've already deprecated it. And, so we see those kinds of things, that.
Yes, that was a good idea.
Yeah. Core bundled extensions, that go in and then they come back out. That I think that's part of the challenge. If you don't go back to the dev docs, that you plan around a feature that was there a year ago, and that's already, maybe it's still there, but it won't be there for long, or, you wind up with those kinds of challenges that I think the content's great and sometimes gives you a much better understanding of the who, what, when, where, why, and how, but you still need to go back and make sure that, technically speaking, that you're on the right path.
Well, and that's why what you're also saying there is just ongoing maintenance. And that's one of the costs with Magento, because maintenance is a part of that. You have to keep it up. You have to install the patches. And that's why BigCommerce and Shopify look attractive to some merchants, simple because they don't have to manage that maintenance. And obviously what they're giving up to an extent, obviously the extent is arguable, but is the customization, right? So they, Magento being open source, every single character of code of the hundreds of thousands of lines of code can be modified. I mean, you can literally change anything you want. And it's just not as possible with Shopify or BigCommerce. Now, it is to an extent, but not as. And so, but that is a cost that merchants have to accept there's this feature to include Magento Commerce. Stuff's going to change, stuff's going to come, and it's possibly going to go. I guess it's less likely it's going to go than come, but that's just, that is how it works.
Well, and usually once things are going, there's often some kind of a good technical reason for it. It is something that's deprecated, that's old tech in some way, and and so it's done in everyone's best interest. Sometimes it's commercial based on deals being done, things like that, like the core bundled extensions. Those are things in partnership with Magento, with Adobe. But by and large, I think that it is nice to maintain that freedom because, so let's say that there's an extension or an integration that you want that's not available with Magento or that gets pulled. Well, just because it's not a core bundled extension anymore doesn't mean that you can't go and install it yourself from the Magento marketplace or what have you.
Yep.
With something like a Shopify, they pull MailChimp from the App Store. You're not integrating MailChimp anymore. That was a fun one a couple of years ago. But, there are all these unique differences it's just such a different environment going from open source and Manifest Destiny to SaaS and really being, giving up the reins to a lot of that and not always to choices that you would have made yourself.
Yes.
So
yes,
nothing against. I think that there's a good case for all of them, and stock prices are doing well. But there are also developers realize that things are still changing, that there's absolutely more maintenance to happen with a Magento site, but it's not zero maintenance with these others that I remember BigCommerce going, changing theming systems between, Blueprint and Stencil and, Shopify changing things like ripping out their old inventory API, replacing it with their multi-address inventory API. So any integration that you had that was reliant on that needed to be rewritten. Not the end of the world. This is all natural, but e-commerce is evolving. It is in flux. And, on the other side of the fence, I find that people have a harder time understanding what their responsibilities are, that the apps that they choose that, with a SaaS platform, you can't install extensions. You can't have that control. So now you wind up installing dozens, in some cases, of apps that have access to all sorts of data that you really don't want them to. They can slow down your site. They can cause security risks in terms of what they can, that they have control of what's displayed in certain widgets and areas of the front end. And if they're hacked or abused, you're out of luck. There's a lot going on there, and you're paying them all monthly fees as opposed to extensions that, yes, you do have to maintain, but by and large, for most of those, you're paying more of a one-time. So you have all of these. It's just such a different choice to make. And if you bottleneck with Magento, you can generally code your way out of it. You bottleneck with SaaS, that can get pretty difficult. You can't necessarily code your way out of every problem. So I like, some of that conversation in the market. I think it's pushing the SaaS companies to continually improve and elevate, and that's good for everyone. I like seeing tech challenged, but I think that the Magento community has stayed strong with more of those mid-market and enterprise players that have the resources to benefit from an open source platform, and I think that's particularly interesting. And so, thinking about those resources from your experience, what is the difference between a more basic developer and a rockstar? You've mentioned a few people out there that helped you along the way or that have really stood out. How do they get to where they are? Is it just sheer experience, or are there other things that really help someone to up their game?
Yeah, I love talking about that subject simply because I'm finalizing a book called The Art of Debugging, and it's targeted at e-commerce developers, and it's not all about just how to debug, how to solve problems. It's the first 5 chapters, the first part of the book, are spent talking about what does it take to be a great developer, and I do my best to make the case it's not just about X number of years on the job. We were recently working on a fairly large project, and there were some really good developers who've been working on it for a long time, and they would definitely be considered senior developers. The quality of the code that they put out was not great, and so it just because one's has had 10 years even of experience on Magento does not make a great developer. What does make a great developer, and I love Elon Musk's comment here. He said they're hiring for SpaceX, basically like rocket engineers. They're looking for people with super hardcore work ethic, talent for building things, common sense, and trustworthiness. And that is literally what I spend the first 5 chapters of that book building out. That was critical to make a rockstar developer. The skills will come, and it comes through experience, right? So, I've had to deal with this difficult problem, and it's et cetera, et cetera. That comes, but it is greatly accelerated with that the character and the characteristics of what I call a great developer, but really is through being a rockstar developer, whatever the term is. It comes through that willingness to approach problems, to solve problems, to see a ticket through every step of the way, knowing how and when and who to ask help from when necessary, having a solid framework embedded into their minds for how to approach a problem, how to dissect it, how to get to the bottom of it. That's what I believe makes a really a rockstar developer.
That's interesting. That I tend to, of course, agree, but I think that from my experience, there are all these different layers to it that you need to, as you hit on, some of it's understanding how to ask the right questions at the onset, and so if you don't get a good user story and understand what the stakeholders really want, how are you possibly going to produce the right thing? So being inquisitive and spending a little bit more time there, in discovery. But then I think, a lot of it look, if Magento 2 wasn't launched when it was in 2015 and it's stuck in development longer, if the devs were able to hold it back, which I'm not saying that the devs had any control there, but it's okay to say that something's not ready to ship out. We wind up at JetRails. I was chatting with some of my teammates recently. We've noticed more devs that have been switching over still from M1 to M2 having challenges with deployment. And some of them, occasionally we run into somebody that's still not using version control, like GitHub. That we run into folks that are manually deploying all sorts of things. And that's okay. But we're working internally to try to best support our partners and developers and folks that, there are some hosting platforms that really give you one path for deployment, and it's very rigid and limiting. We come in and we ask you, what's your deployment process? Which, we think is really healthy. But there are those cases where it's not as defined as you would think from seasoned developers. And so there's this meeting in the middle of, okay, well, obviously we're going to need to make sure that everything goes smoothly here for the client's sake. But what might normally be a developer question starts to come back, toward the host. And I think that there's a lot of that happens in the market in general of figuring out, who's going to take ownership of this, or what is the base standard for this. And like I said, because things are in flux, there isn't always that one solid answer, or because things are up to personal preference, it isn't always about one path. It's about figuring out exactly what's best in this instance and this deployment. Whether we've got someone up on an auto-scaling AWS environment or someone that's, on a single server that we're managing, different animals, different beasts.
Oh yeah.
So, but how do you think that some of the training and education fits in when it comes to happiness? Because I've seen a lot of these things, it really has an impact, not just on the client who's frustrated, not just on, folks like our support team that I think weathers it particularly well when there's a challenge that we love to, to work closely and help to clear roadblocks for people. But for developers, I see them, sometimes just miserable when they're stuck somewhere. Do you find that this sort of thing, that having either resources to rely on or the right training, or maybe a mix of a few things, really has an impact on those kind of metrics? Because I see people burn out sometimes, and I feel terrible about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, being in e-commerce is tough as it is, right? I mean, I think for merchants, they have to keep the lights on, the doors open, the website running. All that is critical. So that's important. Yeah. So I mean, I would say overall, every way training is important. I think from a developer perspective, the companies who invest in continuous training, who set the and for example, one aspect that I very commonly see in training is certifications, and certifications are important simply because, well, they're most valuable is when there's study that has gone into leading up to achieving the certification. And I always tell people the study leading up to the certification is 90% of the value. The other 10% of the value is the certification itself. I'm not trying to devalue certifications. It's just that for a developer personally, the value is so much greater in getting into it and studying. So and through that process that I've taken basically every Magento 2 certification except for one, the endorphins that are released in my brain, and this sounds funny to say, but I come across this new solution or this piece of code. It's like, wow, I had not a clue that was in here. I had no clue it worked like this. And so the agencies or even merchants who have in-house developers who are continually pushing their developers into learning and tackling difficult things and all that stuff. That's where it makes happy developers. Developers love to be challenged. And from what I see, they like challenge almost more than bigger paycheck. Like, yes, I mean, all of us like bigger paychecks, but it's one of the biggest things I see people leaving companies, developers leaving companies, is because the challenge is not enough. Even if the pay is great, the challenge, I'm bored. Developers have to be challenged. Learning is a great way for that challenge to happen.
I know a good 5 years ago, developers that didn't want to keep working on M1 because they knew that was the way of the past, and they didn't want their skills to lose, sight of the end goal of staying at the top of the industry. They wanted to stay sharp. And I think that there's absolutely that drive. And some of it, might be gamification, that we like to win. I can recall my wife, after I told her some certification that I got, whether it was a marketing one or project management or, eCommerce or whatever it was, she said to me something like, "What do you do at work all day? Like, are you playing Pokemon? You're going like gym to gym, getting badges or something?" Right. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Well, now you know what I do all day. So there is something that feels good about achieving something, about proving that not only did you study the material, but you studied it well, that you absorbed something. And I think that pushes you to really absorb more of it than just pure skimming. But I'm with you that it's really about the journey of learning than it is about the badge. That the certification itself, while on some occasions it might open some doors for you, I don't think that that's for most people the big challenge. Although I will admit that having been on the other side of the fence, I wasn't always excited for coworkers of mine to go get certain certifications, because then they'd start to get job offers and other things that were hard for us as an agency to compete with. If you think about it, an agency has to mark up the labor in a certain way, that makes sense. A merchant who's making $100 million a year off their website may not have that same constraint in terms of their profit on that individual employee and such. And so we would wind up competing even more for some of those employees who were then like getting called by headhunters. And so there was that a little bit, but I never wanted to stop someone from getting educated or bettering themselves. But at the same time, I wasn't basically trying to turn on the faucet for for them to be getting calls with other job offers. So a little bit,
it's a balancing,
juxtaposition there to be stuck in, and it definitely had some impact. And I know a lot of the things that we've talked about have to do with sort of, learning from the ground up, even at some midpoint in the process. What do you recommend if someone, they've looked at the dev docs or they've looked at something, they've looked at study guides, they can't figure something out. They're stuck somewhere. Mm-hmm. I know that I'm pretty active with the Magento community forums, with Quora. There are other sites like Stack Exchange out there that are more developer focused. Where do you typically recommend that people go? There are Slack groups related to Magento for the Magento Association and community engineering. Is there anywhere that you would generally, recommend that people go if they're really stuck somewhere and they don't know where else to go?
Yes, absolutely. And before I fully answer that question, the one thing I do want to call out is probably the most underused way to get answers from Magento that I see. And that is, ironically enough, Magento itself. Magento is open source. And we're just doing a developer survey, swiftotter.com/survey. And for any developers who are listening to this, we're trying to figure out what are the common environments that people use, that developers use when building websites. And what I am seeing thus far is that there's a lot of developers who don't use some of the most important tools necessary. And those tools help unlock the capacity to use Magento as a tool for understanding how it works. Like instead of viewing Magento as a big beast with hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and it is, don't get me wrong, but Magento is an incredibly powerful source of answers for itself. That said, I do recognize that there's questions that I've had those myself, and that you just can't figure out. Magento Stack Exchange, in my opinion, seems to be more easier questions and answers. Many of those would be probably able to be solved in the Magento code itself. Many, not all, but many. As far as the more complex stuff, the community engineering, I think that Slack is a great Magento community engineering, great resource for getting into more of those hardcore answers. Another thing that I recommend, and it sounds kind of dumb, but it's the rubber duck, right? And I'm sure most people have heard of this. Go talking to a rubber duck, call a colleague, and walk them through such a problem. It's amazing how much clicks when one just speaks the problem out loud. And us as developers, we're silent, right? I mean, we're listening to our tunes. We're working on slaying these dragons and solving these problems, but we don't usually say a word while we're doing it. And getting out there and actually using our vocal cords to speak about this problem, that's a way of solutions right there. And even some of the most complex problems I've ever had have been solved with rubber ducking. The solution is right there inside my head. It's just somehow vocalizing it brings it to the forefront.
Oh, that's fantastic. I don't think I've ever quite heard it said that way. I've got a Magento rubber duck somewhere in the background here.
Nice.
For anyone that's seeing the video version of this as opposed to listening to the podcast. I probably have talked to that rubber duck a couple of times, but that wasn't about a coding problem. So, a whole other issue.
Yeah, we won't go there.
Yeah. So there are open source problems out there. What are your thoughts for users that are on Magento Commerce? Do you think that their best bet is still going back to a lot of those places and methods that we've just chatted about, or are there cases where they might be better off going to some resource direct from Magento for some kind of getting answered or training or insight?
Yes. Commerce can be a whole different can of worms. It's simply because there's a lot more. There's some more areas that are just not hardly touched. Like very few developers know about target rules and how to customize that. It just because it's hardly, it mostly just works out of the box. And I think that's one of the values that Commerce does bring is it has a lot of really valuable extensions and it works out of the box pretty much. Obviously, there's Magento support that would be available for some of those more difficult problems. But again, a lot of this comes back to solidly identifying the problem and understanding where it's happening in the code. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the book, The Art of Debugging, is because of it helps solve these type of problems. It gives you the tools, the places to go look at for identifying even the most difficult of problems. I think it's pretty much otherwise the same, other than the addition of Adobe support for some of those most complex issues, like troubleshooting bundled products or a problem in the admin related to bundled products. So that would be my suggestion there.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I know that anytime that you go to a more generic support team, you get that challenge of they're not going to know the site as well as you, your developers, that they're not exactly a one-on-one consultant digging through in the same way that a private developer working for you will, that they're generally going to give more blanket answers, more, prefab kind of resources in a lot of ways. So, it's folks like you that are out there that are really, whether they're open source or commerce, I suppose, that are going to need to dig in and often, find that more, because these are usually one-off problems. I mean, I'm sure there are some cases, I've seen some where it's a bug and that just needs to be reported through the right channels in the first place to maybe get some prioritization on getting a bug fix with the next release or such, or an early patch. But that's kind of an interesting area, I suppose, that, just figuring out what the nature of the issue is in the first place, that if you go asking for support before you know if it's related to an extension, if it's a core issue, if there's something else going on. So in terms of debugging software, I know that we love on the hosting side to spin up stuff like, New Relic and Blackfire and all these great solutions that are going to monitor in different ways for different kinds of bottlenecks or errors or issues. Do you have any favorites? Any words to the wise there?
As far as it goes for
debugging software tools that you think that people should, potentially look at? Because I think that's one of the major challenges. We'll wind up where our support team might, have an open ticket that's kind of going in circles where we're saying doesn't appear to be a hosting issue. It looks like it's in the application code, but the developers don't always have the right tools to reasonably find what the source of the issue is, to figure out what line of code, what extension, where this issue is deriving, and that's what's going to push them around to every support channel that they can, trying to find someone that can locate it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, let me put it this way. So in that survey I mentioned, and I'm doing my best to get as many people to share their thoughts there. I am seeing, and this is a surprising number, that over 25% of developers do not use or know of a tool called Xdebug. Xdebug is a software that ties into PHP that allows you to step line by line through the code. You're able to see what all the variables are. You're able to see what's called the call stack. So every method, and I know we're getting a little bit deep there, every method that has occurred up until this point. And so the big picture is that this is like discovery for a developer like nothing else. And so that is the number one tool. And
as
again,
opposed to some of the things I was mentioning, like New Relic, that have licensing costs, Xdebug is free open source software, right? So
it is, yes.
No reason not to use that, even on a small project.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it is absolutely phenomenal and critical to use. And so I recommend using it all the time. And yeah, so that's that. I use it all day, every day. Like that is what I use to help solve problems. And of course, New Relic.
I know. I recently wrote an article about Magento speed optimization, and I polled members of the community, and it was interesting. And I didn't know what they were going to come back with. I asked them basically, "What's your favorite tool for speed optimization?" Not specifically debugging. I got things that related to content delivery networks and speed tests and caching and load testing and all sorts of things. Even just following best practice and going back to the dev docs. But yes. I thought it was interesting that, I got people responding multiple with New Relic. Someone wrote in about Blackfire, someone about Tideways, which I haven't spent as much time with Tideways myself. But I think that it's particularly interesting that even for speed optimization, that a lot of these experts in the community were coming back to debugging in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Well, and that's another thing with Xdebug. And actually, because of this, we're doing a free course, so it doesn't cost any money, called Mastering Xdebug. There's using the Xdebug Profiler. So that is a great way to see what is taking a long time with this. A quick story here. There was we were working with a merchant, and They hired some other some work out on their website, and so we were coming in after the fact, and they reported that their category pages were incredibly slow. Okay, they're slow. Well, let's try to troubleshoot this. Again, Xdebug coming to the rescue. We were used that and the profiler, i.e., seeing how long all these methods takes, just so and how much memory they use. We were finding that every category page loaded every single product, and there was thousands of products. So every product was being loaded on a given category page. The fix was very easy. It was poor development, and it could have come back to even a senior developer possibly could have missed this. I'm not 100% sure there, but that profiler gave us that perspective into what was going on, and that's where having knowledge of those tools is absolutely critical. And if there's performance problems, if there's debug or problems to solve, Xdebug is probably probably nothing. It's literally what a developer is going to use to solve it.
Awesome. I'm going to have to get a little more info from you to throw in that article I've got up there, but
sure.
But for sure, we'll put in the show description for this episode, show notes, any links to any of those free resources you were mentioning, because that's always fantastic. I know people really appreciate that. Now, I know we talked a little bit about the certifications, not the be all end all, but I know that sometimes, not everybody finds that that they're great with exams. It's not everyone's forte, which is reasonable. We're all different learners and all respond differently to those kinds of things. Do you find that amount of hands-on learning is necessary to really do well with those exams? Do you think that someone can really learn it all from a course and then go take the exam? Or do you think that in the case of a platform like Magento, that they really do need to spend an amount of time working to really absorb or understand, unless they just have like a photographic memory?
Yes. Well, that's the thing with Magento tests. Up until this point, there was a man by the name of Peter Manajak who was kind of the brainchild of that effort. And Peter was in the test that Peter puts out, which is basically the entire repertoire of Magento tests at this point. Those are incredibly difficult tests. They are almost entirely made up of what's called scenario-based questions. In other words, it kind of tells a story and asks you to answer the question. And so I was talking to somebody recently. They were talking about another test that they were taking, not a Magento test. And they were like, I literally did not know anything about the platform. And I went through and just answered the questions because the distractors were so dumb. And so the Magento tests are just not like that. They're solid. They are difficult. And so hands-on experience is 100% required. When I was helping write you took the solution specialist. So when we rewrote that test, it was funny. The way it would work, someone write a question and someone else in the room would read that question and answers, just to kind of, so we don't, the writer doesn't like sugarcoat and make sure it's a good question or like everybody accepts it. But there was a number of times when writing that new solution specialist test that people will just, the whole room of all these experts would just break out laughing because they had been through that problem. They had seen it, and it was so real. And so absolutely hands-on experience is totally critical to passing it. And with like the courses, those will help accelerate the amount of hands-on experience necessary. The good ones should have practical experience, practical projects, things that, get you in the code, get you in the admin. There is no substitute for doing this stuff that the test requires you to know about. You got to get in there, got to do it. And that's where I was saying earlier, the value of the tests. I might be a little bit dramatic here, but putting a 90% value on the study, the preparation process, that's where the value is. And yes, the certification is proof of that. So ultimately, maybe it's more than 10%, but I focus in on that study because that's where the value is.
And how long do you think, I know that there's absolutely no perfect answer for this, but if, let's say, an agency wants to have a timeline for, getting people, like running a contest. I know some interesting folks that try to run contests around getting people Magento certified. I don't know if you do, though.
Yes, actually. Yes,
yeah, you have.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Let's segue to that for a second. I'll come back to my question right after.
Okay. Yeah. I know. It's funny helping people get Magento, getting certified. I probably shouldn't limit myself to Magento, but helping people get certified, I find it to be incredibly fulfilling because it makes a difference. It makes a difference, encouraging people to sit down, to take that time, to be consistent, and so that's why we're finishing up, wrapping up the 2021 Swift Auto Challenge to become a Magento certified, and it's been incredibly successful. People are. I did it last year and I did it this year, and I can't remember how many we're up to as far as people who've gotten certified. It's a ton of people already this year, and it makes a difference for them. They're proud of it. And I also have, as part of that challenge, I have a really large Slack community that's growing and thriving of people talking about getting certified and the challenges they're facing in that. And then they post there, and people are incredibly excited, and it's motivating in that. So yeah, there's been a tremendous amount of what's the term? The term's not coming to my mind. A mutual motivation through that challenge, and I'm really excited. And of course, I'm giving away a couple Apple Watches too, so it might be the lucky winner there.
Nothing wrong with that. Look, I remember it's going back a few years, but I had Google certifications for years, and they ran some kind of promotion where they sent awards and different things for people that passed all the exams. So I found myself by a certain date, and that gamification, that motivation, that okay, well, I don't know, I keep not getting around to this, but I'm going to do it this time. I'm going to make the time that getting certified in Google Shopping and video ads and all these different subsets, along with Google Analytics and other things that knocked them all out within I don't know, a week or something, and felt good about it. And that's going to take me back into the question that I paused.
Yeah.
About how long does it take? Like, so when you run this challenge, how long do you give people to study and then schedule and take the exam? What do you think again, now we've already hit on that someone should have some hands-on experience first, but how long do you think it really takes for someone to be able to study and prep? Because some of these questions really, they're nuanced. I know from muscle memory where I would go in the Magento admin to do something. Do I remember exactly word by word the pathing, the routing to get there through all the different steps? Some things, yes. Some things I might scratch my head and I want to pass the exam. So some of it is memorization.
Well, actually, and I'll push back there just a little bit, because on the Magento tests, the old versions and the one you took, I think the first round, yes, there was a lot of memorization there, but Peter's emphasis has been very much to focus less on memorization, because anybody can memorize facts, but it comes from this personal experience of, like an example of let's just throw out, I'm going to completely make up a question here, but it's be something like a merchant is trying to do X, Y, and Z in Magento. Like, how would they go about doing that? And then there'd be 4 answers, and one of them would be something like, there's a change this setting in store configuration. So it's not necessarily a specific path. Maybe another one would be install a module to do this. Another one would be flush the cache, whatever, right? So ultimately, the questions on the tests are designed to are designed to be relevant to one's memory, in the fact that, okay, I've done this before. And the good news is this is not less like picking out 4 store configuration paths and saying, this is the one that that would be very difficult for me, because memory is not my forte. So that can be a positive thing. But on the other hand, I find it actually makes tests more difficult, simply because you can't just memorize a bunch of facts like a cheat sheet and go expect to pass the test, because it just doesn't happen. As such, the preparation becomes all the more important. Well, I find that
ideally you don't even know exactly which questions you're going to be asked and in which order, and it becomes more difficult to know exactly that. It's more about concepts in a good exam like that, where you really do have to have the fundamentals that you can't fake the fundamentals.
Mm-mm. Oh, you can't. You absolutely cannot. And it's people. I've seen senior developers fail the easiest Magento test. It is what it is. As far as the hands are, what does it take to study and prepare for the exam? My biggest point is consistency. Whether it's 15 minutes a day, whether it's 30 minutes a day, every day that one does not study, I find it takes away from X number of previous days of study. Like it has a cumulative effect of erasing that you're in the mood, you're working to study for this. Okay, so the certification challenge, last year I did it for, was it 3 months? I expected you to have your certification scores in by the end of March. That was, of course, the COVID year. Thank you. And so I extended it. This year I also extended it. So I'm requiring scores to be in by the end of May. And so far we've not had another global pandemic hit. So we're probably going to be able to, we're going to be probably able to hit our end of May deadline. And so I find that 5 months, but probably more like 3 to 4 months is a good average. Again, with 15 to 30 minutes a day, probably closer to 30 minutes a day, is a good average for somebody who has been in Magento. They are, how do I say this? They're familiar with it. It's not like, okay, January 1, they just signed on with a merchant or an agency, and then they're supposed to pass the test by the end of May. For somebody super ambitious, yes, I'm going to say that's possible. But for most everybody else, not that other people aren't ambitious. It's just that we have life, we have work. It's just hard to fit stuff in. That would be a lot less realistic.
Interesting. I mean, I'll admit that for the solution specialist stuff, which it sounds like is, I took some dated exams, but I'll admit that I crammed that stuff, that I only gave it a few days in advance because, at the time running an agency, that's what I could do. That's what I could give it. So maybe some of it we'll just blame on luck, but I could see where, I knew that if I was training one of my coworkers on it that hadn't had the time that I'd had in doing what I was doing, there was no way. There were too many areas to be experienced with, too many concepts to be familiar with, that I think that at that point, that really is a lot of the challenge. It's that like you said, it really is a lot of competencies that you're expected to have in order to get through one of these exams. This is not a walk in the park.
And one thing
and I walked out not knowing if I passed. So maybe that's, maybe I have a little more humility than I let on the podcast. But,
yeah. Well, and that's one thing I do throw out in some contexts is that, failure is not the worst case approach or a worst case outcome from trying to attempt a test. And if one feels like it's worth it, and ultimately it comes down to the value of time versus money. And if one's time is worth more than $300 US, then, one can go sit down, do some cramming for a day or two, take the test. If you pass, you just might have saved yourself a couple months of some consistent work. So that is definitely an option. And to be frank, I've done that myself. So, it does work. And, but for many people, if you are working with an agency and the agency says, hey, I'm going to pay for this test. And some have the stipulation, if you pass it, it carries higher stakes with it. And thus it warrants the additional study time. And again, it's not like the study time is worthless, right? Because you get so much value out of it.
Absolutely. And look, in terms of some of those agencies, if you're a paid Adobe partner, paid Magento partner, there are expectations that you're going to get a certain number of people certified. So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that there is that push, that drive, because look, you're paying for that Adobe partnership. So you want to get your money out of it and you want to check all the boxes. And if you want to move higher up in the rankings, same thing, you need to be referring enough people for Magento Commerce. You need to be, getting enough people certified. You need to check boxes in order to really see the long-term benefits of going that particular partnership route. So I've seen that certainly help the numbers there. And I've seen some agencies do some amazing things in terms of the number of team members getting certified. And
Meteotype set the way. I mean, those guys crushed it. Like, was it that last year?
Yeah,
I think that was last year.
I think so.
Totally crushed it.
Now, Joel and his team. I mean, I don't remember if that was probably before the Blue Acorn acquisition. Yep. They did some really amazing stuff with it. I've seen some others where they take it real serious. And look, education's good, so I'm on board with that concept. Speaking of Adobe, beyond the branding, has the Adobe acquisition had much impact on these different learning avenues and certifications? I know that, I went from being a Magento certified, et cetera, to being like an Adobe expert. There's, new badges and branding and things. And it sounds like tests have been getting certain upgrades. I'm not sure how much of that has to do with the acquisition, but what has been changing in the last, few years as it relates to all this? Or has it been, pretty much just staying the course, pun intended?
Good. That was a good pun. I like that. Yeah. So from my perspective, at least from what I've seen, things have stayed pretty much the same. A lot of the Magento core team has left, and so it's with a new team, and ultimately time will tell. I think as far as how much value Adobe places on it, and they've made good commitments toward that, but again, time always does tell on that. I think the changes to the tests, the certifications have been very minimal. But a couple of things. First, like you mentioned, the names have changed, the badges have changed. The other thing is the time to take a test has changed from 1.5 to 2 hours. So that's actually been really helpful. I think it's helped other people take the test. But as far as for everybody else's perspectives, if you're not necessarily planning to be a test taker, I think the value of the test remains pretty much the same as well as far as people are as far as people are concerned. There's solid tests, and they will be going through an update cycle eventually. Actually, the other update on that, and this caused a lot of confusion. That was partially my fault. Is the question of whether they expire or not, or how one handles that, because ultimately, I got certified with a first solution specialist, and that was 2018, I think, August of 2018, maybe. And ultimately, is that certification still as valid or relevant today as it was back then? And that's kind of the age-old debate. Some people handle that with expiring certifications. Other people would do that with versioning them, et cetera, et cetera. So that we understand that in 2021, i.e. this year, Adobe will make a decision on that. And of course, they will let everybody know. So that is probably the biggest change in the pipeline that is coming as far as what happens with expiration and certifications.
Excellent. So when I need to go certify again, basically, we're going to do another one of these, and I'm going to ask you every question that I'm uncertain of, and that's going to be my cramming.
Well, sure. We'll see what we can do there.
Yeah. And, I wonder, there are certain areas that I commonly find that maybe not enough folks in the community are as well versed as would be ideal. Do you find that maybe there are some areas that, as things get refreshed, that they really should or need to be added? I know that I run into a lot of folks vis-a-vis, hosting partnerships here at JetRails, that their understanding of PCI compliance could probably use a little bit more work. Their understanding of GDPR and certain other regulations could probably use a little bit of leveling up. And that's not to say that these people aren't phenomenal experts in certain arenas, but will get requests to do things to hosting environments that would invalidate PCI compliance or that would have other issues. And that's kind of constant. And at that point, we're having a debate about something that ideally shouldn't be up for debate. It should be an obvious. Do you find, is that an education issue from your perspective? Are there some of these things that maybe we provide a very base level as a community, but that should be more required?
Yes, absolutely. I think as far as education, that's really important. Again, coming from a very technical perspective, the couple of the things that I find are usually more or less related to performance. So you mentioned more or less compliance and legal aspects, and I'm sure you guys deal with that a lot. But also on the technical side, for example, how one handles performance optimization. We've been using RabbitMQ, like message queuing. We've been using that a ton in our recent projects, and I see hardly anybody else doing that. And that is such a phenomenal way to push expensive operations out of a web request. So for example, you save a product and instead of doing some expensive calculation or process or reconfiguration, well, example, that project I was telling you about that we've been working on.
You're taking the weight off the database and you're putting it into RabbitMQ. Oh, I love it. We've got, so it is worth it because it's native integration now, just like Elasticsearch and so many other things have become part of the stack. I think that it's definitely something that more people should be utilizing. And we are, at least for our segment of users, we're seeing more and more using it, which is interesting. And even those that are using other messaging queue services, like from Amazon, from AWS, we've got both. They're using, Amazon's queuing, they're using, RabbitMQ, which is a VMware product. They're using that and in different ways, but because of the native Magento integration, they're benefiting there from Rabbit. I think it's phenomenal. But
absolutely,
but you had this interesting project that you were mentioning.
Yeah, real quick. But basically, part of that is we have to build this massive JSON array. We have to build this data object. And for some of these products, like a configurable product with like a shirt, you have, one of these I think has 130 different colors. So 130 different SKUs that the merchant will ship from their shelf. It becomes, again, a very expensive operation at loading time in order to calculate this and to build this data object. And so RabbitMQ, it makes it asynchronous. So when you save the product, that we can pre-calculate that, but it doesn't affect the admin load time or the save time for when the admin clicks the save button. It just pushes it off into a background process that runs at some later time. Usually it's within a second or two, but it pushes it off. And I find that incredibly valuable. A lot of the newer features with Magento, Elasticsearch, that's kind of a big dark secret that a lot of and ultimately comes down to, from a merchant's benefit, understanding how to optimize search results. Mm-hmm. Very little is known about that because it's complex. It's totally complex. And honestly, Magento's implementation is not necessarily ideal from my perspective, at least with the work I've done on that. Using the API. Yeah.
Being familiar with to get it where you want it to be, for sure, is everything that I hear on the street. Is that people that think that it's plug and play and it's ready to go. If you're looking for that, maybe go to one of the players like SearchSpring out there that's going to do a lot of that for you. Yeah, there's a bunch of them that do some real good work. But if you want to use Elastic, it's interesting, and I think some of this comes down to agency by agency. I was seeing with RabbitMQ. There's an agency, Core Shop Solutions, that was doing some great stuff using it as part of integrating third-party systems like ERP and PIM. And so, just thinking about, now you have this thing installed, it's there. Now, how are you going to utilize it and benefit from it? And, what version are you using? And there's this bigger conversation. I think part of the challenge that's happening there that I'm trying to get a handle on myself is I don't even know if the merchants themselves, the e-commerce managers, the website owners, the business owners, whatever size, whatever VPs or things, larger organizations, I don't know if they even understand what RabbitMQ is or that they have it. It's because it's native and the developers, they will usually use the open source version. They're usually not going for like an enterprise paid version for this use case. And so it's just there. And because nobody really even thinks about it, they're not thinking about how else can I leverage this and utilize this. It kind of gets lost in the process. So I think that sometimes circling back to thinking about, okay, well, this is now going to be part of the stack. And let's think about, how we should be utilizing it as we build. Sometimes those kind of things get lost. I agree completely that underutilized.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important that developers just learn this stuff, because again, it should be transparent to merchants. Merchants should not have to even almost ever hear the term RabbitMQ. It's just that developers, in my opinion, should know that RabbitMQ is there available. That should be my opinion, that should be part of every hosting stack, i.e. when it's going to be used. I mean, I'm sure in some cases it would never be used, so it doesn't need to be, but developers should be pushing for that, asking for it. Hey, this is important. This is what I'm going to be using. And it's not even a conversation point, at least with the merchant. It's just something the developer does. Everything that they put into the software, if it takes processing, it's going through RabbitMQ. Unless it doesn't make sense, but it's just using that all the time. I totally agree. And to be frank, that's where it comes down to. I've seen it so many times. I've seen some case studies for other shopping carts and presumably Magento too. And they talk about what a failure this other shopping cart, this other e-commerce platform was. And in reality, as you dig into it, it was the agency that was the failure. It was the developers that were struggling or maybe in over their head. It had less to do with the platform itself. And so that's where this continued education, this continued learning, even if the platform is somewhat subpar, like even if it could use some help, I find over and over it's the developers and ultimately the umbrella over them is the agency that makes the difference in almost every case.
We know, one of the things that I do here, we have kind of this Magento Matchmaker program, and it started off as something that we help our existing clients with, that they'd say, hey, I've outgrown the freelancer I was working with, or I need to go from M1 to M2. I have in-house devs. We need more than that to get through this project. Who can you recommend? And we basically thought about, well, who's doing really good work in our network? Who do we have really happy mutual customers with? Because at the end of the day, that's what counts. Yeah. We know that in terms of our attrition rate, that while it's extremely low, that the clients that we lose, we don't lose them to other hosts. We lose them because they had problems that couldn't be resolved in a way that was reasonable for them, in a way that made them satisfied, and they decided to abandon the platform. And so for us, we have this vested interest in working with great devs and making sure that they're getting well educated and that they're staying at the top of their game. Just like we have to on our side, and we have to meet in the middle and communicate really well and work together and not kick the can, solve whatever issues are arising. Yes. And I think that's such a crucial part of these situations that's often missed. It's not that the platform can't or couldn't, or the number of times that I got my hands on a project that someone else had started, and I needed to tell the website, the business owner, I think that you should start over because, this thing is so off book. It is so upside down when we think about best practice that I don't know when the bleeding will stop in terms of piecemeal trying to reverse engineer and fix this one piece at a time.
And they're done that.
Yeah, it's a painful conversation to have.
It is.
You're bringing somebody bad news. Nobody wants to hear that they dropped thousands and thousands of dollars into something that that you think they should abandon. But better than the opposite. Than getting months into it with them and having them still be unhappy and what have you. So at least they got a clear answer. But that wasn't because it couldn't have been done well. It was because whoever, and I've even seen it where it's from a big agency, but something is outsourced, or there's kind of the A team and there's the D team. And well, you didn't get the A team on this, did you? I think that, those things happen. And some of them, there's an amount of understanding that, employers can put a lot of best practice into place themselves in terms of quality assurance. Mm-hmm. Sometimes something can slip through. I think that through the years that those that have been in the industry longer, they've got more best practice to catch a lot of that code review and other things happening. But I think that is a lot of the challenge, that anyone listening to this can appreciate. That I think everybody's seen at this point or heard of a project that went south, and not just with Magento. This could be with, you name your platform, pretty much anything.
Anything, any platform. People switch, BigCommerce
go to Fiverr, hire a developer today and, see what happens. Maybe you get a good one. Maybe you don't. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I really believe it's more about the developer, the agency, and ultimately how much the agency invests in the developers, the quality of the developers that are hired. that really makes or breaks the relationship and the perspective or view of a platform. There's people switching from Magento to BigCommerce because they don't like something about Magento. There's people about switching from BigCommerce to Magento. Like those changes are real, but I think a lot of it is affected through training, through information. So developers aren't saying, no, this is not possible. They're saying, here's how it is possible. Mm-hmm. And the more experience they have, the faster it is to be able to implement this change to solve this problem.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, sometimes my challenge is when I hear that somebody got sold something by someone who, obviously was looking to make a sale, which is reasonable. Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody's got to eat, but they weren't necessarily experts in helping someone through that decision. So they knew one platform. Like there are teams that really only work with Magento Commerce, and that's what they're going to push. They're not going to tell you that, you could do that for a fraction of the price using Magento open source. You'll get the same where somebody will say, oh, we're going to take you onto Shopify. You're going to have a great time. But they haven't really pointed out the fact that you're going to need to write custom apps. You're going to be bottlenecking with some of the tools that you're going to be using that this isn't really made for your use case. And next thing you know, you're coming back. We deal with the same where people get sold on Magento Commerce Cloud and eventually make their way back for the layers of support and customization and what we're able to deliver in terms of flexibility and scalability. And it's apples and oranges. It's not that Shopify or Magento Commerce Cloud or this or that aren't Magento open source, Magento Commerce. These are good for a lot of people and a lot of use cases. The question is always, is it the right decision for you? And finding a reliable consultant that understands the nuances, that knows the differences, and that will guide you, not because they're trying to hit a partnership quota, not because they have some other business need, but because that's what they're being paid to do, that they work for you. And that's a lot of the challenge I find in the market, because when people get guided towards something solid that really is a good match, it's a good fit. I love when I see people that are really going to get value out of the Magento Commerce license go to Magento Commerce. And I feel terrible when I see someone that I see sold on it that is just tying up revenue that should be going to marketing and growth and other things when they're really not using the features.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. So I should probably start to wrap up. You've been really generous with your time today. And I've probably done a little more talking than I do in some episodes because I get jazzed up about Magento and the Magento community. But any final words of wisdom? Yeah.
I was going to say I need the help in knowing what to say and all that. So I do appreciate you guiding me there.
I don't know about that. I think you held your own just fine. But anything that you want to add before we wrap for the day?
Well, I just want to say thank you for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I guess if I would say if there's developers listening to this, swiftotter.com/survey, I'm looking to get all the information I can about local environments, all that stuff. And because again, my goal is to empower developers, and I do that through a number of ways, but want to empower developers to help them be successful. We talk about training, all that stuff, because I won't repeat all that, but there's empowered developers is the name of the game, and it's absolutely critical.
Maybe when you get all the data, we'll do a short episode and dive through it, or we'll get we'll twist your arm into writing a blog article or something. We'll get the information out there to our listeners, because that sounds really. I love information like that. I find it to be really insightful and impactful. Yeah, well,
critical.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it. This was fantastic. To our listeners, as always, thanks for tuning in. And we'll have more great content like this for you shortly. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy selling out there.